I want to talk now about COVID because we spoke about this to this poor lady who had side effects from the AstraZeneca vaccine. We now know that those vaccines caused all sorts of problems like myocarditis particularly. There's actually quite an interesting paper today showing that COVID itself causes worse myocarditis, but whenever I read these now, I'm very sceptical about the data behind them. If you remember, we were told about the vaccination programme that if you were immunised, it stopped you getting COVID and stopped you passing COVID on, both of which were abject lies, and we were lied to, and a lot of policy was predicated on incorrect data, and I'm being very kind about this. Well, now Mark Zuckerberg has said COVID censorship was wrong, and he went further to say, I wish I'd fought it. That's right. Mark Zuckerberg has said Facebook and Instagram were wrong to censor posts about COVID during the pandemic, and that the company should have fought pressure from the Biden administration. He wrote a letter to a US committee investigating online content moderation. He said that it was the White House that repeatedly pressured the company after Biden was inaugurated in 2021. He said Facebook then made choices based upon that pressure that he wouldn't make today. Senior officials, he said, from the Biden administration repeatedly pressured our team for months to censor content, completely, including humour and satire. And they also disagreed, and they had a sense of frustration with the teams when they wouldn't agree. He said it was ultimately his decision and he wouldn't do it again. Joining me now is Mark Johnson, who's Advocacy Manager of Big Brother Watch. Good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon, David.
It's chilling, actually, isn't it, that you've got basically political powers and political figures pressurising social media platforms, telling them what they can and can't post, and that if they don't like something one of us writes, it gets removed. That's censorship.
It is, and it's incredibly chilling. And we know that an awful lot of this was going on during the pandemic. There was something of a kind of free speech crackdown. We saw channels like your own, Talk Radio, was taken off air because of the policies that, because of discussions of criticism of government policies. Big Brother Watch, we had a civil liberties video on vaccine passports taken down just purely on the societal implications on our YouTube channel. And there were various other examples during the pandemic. This is the first time it has been, there's been an admission from somebody like Mark Zuckerberg that this went on. And it is deeply chilling. It's really concerning, and it has an impact on all of our right to freedom of expression. And there should be loads of lessons learned from this period, and at least Mark Zuckerberg is starting to reflect on that.
I would agree. Also, people like me were under investigation by the government. I know Julia was as well, because we just happened to say, look, we don't really believe the narrative, or at least we questioned the narrative. We didn't believe certain things that were said. I still have people saying to me that I advised people to get vaccines. Well, I did, but it was predicated on what we were being told by central government, which turns out to be a pack of lies.
That's right. There was a counter-disinformation unit, which, by the way, is still operational today, which monitored the entirely legitimate speech of academics, activists, journalists, even politicians within the Conservative Party. Look, there is a role for government to fight the kind of concerted disinformation campaigns of hostile foreign states. We know that. But the counter-disinformation unit in the government went significantly beyond that. They looked at criticism of government policy, they looked at dissent. And what is really chilling about that body, which, as I said, still exists today, is that they have a hotline to the social media platforms, which allows them to push for the censorship of entirely lawful speech. And that's still going on today. Really concerning.
It is really concerning indeed, because during the pandemic, the Facebook added misinformation alerts to users when they commented or liked on posts. It was basically so subjective because it was whether they believed that these were accurate reports. Even if you happen to say, I think that COVID came because it was man-made in a Chinese lab, which looks increasingly likely out of Wuhan, those posts were taken down.
Yeah, they were. And look, that's an entirely reasonable discussion. We should be able to talk about the origins of a virus that impacts all of our lives. I think one of the most brazen moments during the pandemic was actually when the social media platforms reversed their policy on censoring discussion about the origins of COVID, because the White House said, hold on a second, we actually think, we might investigate this line of inquiry. And only at that point in time did they start to consider, oh, maybe we should let everybody else talk about this too. Completely shameless. And the most important thing, regardless of your perspective on any of these issues, is that we should be able to talk about them freely and openly, especially when there's such a societal implication, such as the origins of a virus that had an impact on all of our lives.
And this counter-disinformation unit, I mean, you say it's still operational. What's its remit currently?
They have rebranded slightly. I don't know if that necessarily means that what they're doing is any, less of an impact on our right to free speech. It's now the National Security Online Information Team. It sounds kind of more scary, if you like, more legitimate, perhaps. I'm not sure. But a parliamentary committee last year said that unit should be subject to an independent investigation. I think the Starmer government should take heed of that recommendation. They should open it up properly to transparency, to scrutiny, and an investigation, so we know what's going on and what impact it is having on our right to free speech.
And of course, it is the cornerstone of our democracy to have free speech.
Absolutely, it's the principle, it's the bedrock that our democracy is founded on. It is a right that we all should always enjoy, and we lose it at our peril. There are lots of examples throughout history of societies that had freedom of expression that have lost it. They're all pretty dark examples. We need free speech. We need to protect free speech at all costs. And, these examples of this kind of convergence between governments and social media platforms getting together, collaborating, and, pushing for the removal of speech, which is entirely lawful, but sometimes controversial or, uncomfortable for them. They're really, really troubling examples, and we should jump on that now before the slide goes too far.
And how do we jump on it? If you've got an increasingly authoritarian government, and certainly looking at that press conference today, Starmer did not like being questioned on certain things, and if you've got an authoritarian regime tightening what we can and we can't say, how do we fight that? Aren't we powerless against a huge government machine?
We're not powerless by any means, David. I mean, the first thing I would say is, for your listeners, check out Big Brother Watch, see the work that we're doing. We published a massive investigation into the counter-disinformation unit last year. And actually, as a result, we did find through our research that following that investigation, the number of kind of censorship requests from that unit to social media platforms dropped significantly. We have to keep our finger on the pulse because this is a unit that is still operational. The government could just ramp it up anytime that they want. But through transparency, through putting pressure on the government, we can make change happen and we can push back. And it's not all a one-way track. But the most important thing is eternal vigilance, because that is the price of our liberty at the end of the day.
I mean, I still can't believe they were tracking people with your mobile phone, triangulating you when they told you to stay at home. And of course, I mean, when you look back at what they did to us, I mean, I think it's pretty abhorrent, actually.
I mean, it was a really authoritarian period. And I think one of the most concerning things was that perhaps it opened the door to, a plethora of other more authoritarian practices that will stay with us going forward. I hope they won't. But often the case with these things is that there is a kind of ratcheting effect and new precedents are set, and then governments feel more able to do that in the future. We saw crackdowns on protests in that time. We saw the imposition of vaccine passports on the population. There are a number of really concerning kind of civil liberties implications. And, of course, the censorship element was there to be seen as well. That period is obviously over. The most important thing we can do now is reflect on it. It's good that people like Mark Zuckerberg are, admitting perhaps we went a little bit too far during that time. I think the test of a democracy is how much you protect your rights and freedoms in the most difficult times, because it's quite easy to say we have the right to free speech in these more kind of less troubled times, but actually during those difficult times, that's when it's important to stand up and say no, hold on, this is a line in the sand we shouldn't cross. The reflections are being made now. It's important that we actually listen to them and continue to push back against ongoing authoritarianism in society.
Well said, Mark. Thanks ever so much for your time this afternoon. Mark Johnson, the Advocacy Manager at Big Brother Watch.